Hello and welcome to our strategic talk within the Strategic Compass program of Harici. Today we have Professor Ulrike Guérot, who is the founder and co-director of the European Democracy Lab. He's a professor of political science and international relations. She has kindly accepted to join our invitation for a talk on the latest developments in Europe. We have been following what has been happening in Europe across the board. Actually, the anti-establishment parties have done extremely well in the latest elections for the European Parliament, and she is the person to talk about all those, including the anti-American feeling across the European countries, and all the other features of the rising political parties. Hello, Ulrike. Thank you very much for joining us.
Hi, hello, Hasan. I'm very happy and I'm even proud to be with you to talk about all these interesting and challenging issues.
Well, that is my pleasure. Actually, I am proud to host you in my program, which is called the Strategic Compass, and we do talks of this sort with Turkish as well as international experts on a variety of topics. This time, I'm extremely happy that you have taken your time out to join us. It is particularly this time because last week we had the European Parliament elections, and the result was quite extraordinary. Although, you know, we were together in Istanbul in a meeting organized by Harici, and then we talked about the coming avalanche, if you like, in the European politics. So neither of us was perhaps so much taken aback by what happened, but you know, it's a nice surprise that the anti-establishment parties, or maybe is it a nice surprise? I don't know. I want to hear. I'd like to hear your take. The anti-establishment parties have done extremely well in the elections. Now, let me have your take first. You know, on all the general points, and then we can go into some details on certain topics.
Well, the general impression is, as you said, that we have what could be called a blue wave, you know, in the EP elections. Voter turnout was a little higher than expected. You could have expected that that's a very, very low turnout, which normally is the case for European election, but it was quite stable. I mean, depending on countries, but just because the resentment against the current European Union is big, I think voter turnout wasn't finally so bad. And yes, we saw what you said, the blue wave. I mean, many of these right-wing populist, nationalist, or right extreme parties, whatever you want to call them, had astonishing results. The AfD was very strong in Germany. The FPÖ in Austria came out first party. And as you know, we had an overwhelming result by Rassemblement National in France, on which Macron, in the same evening, declared that he would go for new elections in France, which will take place basically a week from now, next Sunday. So very short time to do the new elections, 30% for the Rassemblement National. So having said this, it goes without saying that the current sort of the leading coalition, as we say in the European Union, has been shortened. Frau von der Leyen, Commissioner, the President of the European Commission, von der Leyen, will have a hard time to build a coalition, and that is what's basically happening in Brussels as we speak. I mean, since 72 hours, they're trying to negotiate who is going to be the next President of the Commission. And what we see is that although the, say, let's call it the classical coalition, which is built by the EPP, the European People's Party, the Social Democrats, the Liberals, and the Greens, that this coalition altogether has something a little bit more than 400 votes. you need 362 for having a majority, but as you have normally many absences and no turnouts, it's a very, very sharp majority that Mrs. von der Leyen has. So the negotiation now is whether the Greens will join the coalition. And the Greens make as a precondition that the Green Deal is continued. But because the votes are short, Mrs. von der Leyen is set to have also talks with Giorgia Meloni from Fraternità Italiana, so the sort of right-wing party in Italy. And this is more or less now the game which is taking place in terms of the presidency, which is to where will Mrs. von der Leyen look? To the Greens, what are the conditions from the Greens, or will she perhaps need and even negotiate votes from Fraternità Italiana? So in one sentence, this European election has shown that the anti-EU establishment is strong in most of the EU countries, and that nothing will be like before. There is tectonical shifts in the structure of the coalition building. There's tectonical shifts in the way that the European Parliament is functioning, and I think we can all be curious to what will be happening. Yeah, that's my very short first take on this.
Well, thank you very much. Yes, we seem to agree, eye to eye on. I mean, that was also my sense when I heard the election results first. Things are not going to be like that from then onwards. Not only in the European Parliament, but across Europe, and particularly within the EU establishment in general. Now, let's talk about the certain specifics and the features and general characteristics of these parties that have actually risen, not out of the blue, because it was something that was coming despite the media blackout in the mainstream media blackout on these parties. They didn't want to see that they were actually making strong gains in Germany in particular. In Austria, again, there was a strong blackout on their coming. Now, can we talk about the certain features of these parties? Now, there is this dismissive way of description. Extreme right is on the rise. I mean, are they really extreme right, or can we simply just dismiss them as extreme right? They are quite anti-war, for instance. Now, those nice parties who style themselves basically liberals and Democrats and what have you are warmongers, and these parties are anti-war. How do you and there is also this problem of the real left is also coming up, I think, particularly in Germany, with what's her name's newly created party has got 6% of the votes, which is also
Sarah Wagenknecht, BSW.
Yeah. I find her surname a bit difficult, but when I hear it from you, then I'll follow your way of the pronunciation. What would you say about the certain all these characteristics of these parties? For instance, they are anti-American, they are anti-European Union, they are anti-migration, and why would these basically attitudes make them extreme right?
Well, thank you for the question. I think it's even more complex. I mean, first we need to say that, for instance, we have now a very difficult coalition building at the European level, and also in terms of the party groups. Yeah, as you know, we are voting national parties, and then the national parties are forming European party groups, like all the conservative parties are going to the European People's Party, and all the social democratic and socialist parties are going to the alliance SD, and so on and so forth, the liberals, and so on and so forth. So on the right spectrum, there are actually two groups, and there there is the right-wing group and then the identitarian group. And for the moment, it's not yet clear how this will unfold. As you may have noticed, there was an interview of the leading person of the German AfD, Maximilian Krah, who gave an interview in the Italian newspaper La Repubblica, and where he issued some sentence on the former SS in Germany. And there was a huge sort of contest against this interview. And as a reaction, Marine Le Pen basically decided that the AfD should not be in the right-wing group at the level of the European Parliament. So the AfD, for now at least, yeah, this is still in the making, and perhaps we will see that they come back. But there is talk about exclusion of the German AfD from this ERK group, yeah, from the right spectrum of the spectrum. And so we will need to know where all the other, say, populist or nationalist or right-wing parties will be standing, because between the PiS, the Polish party, and the Fidesz, the Hungarian party, FPÖ, Austria, Rassemblement National in France, or Swedish Democrats, or the German AfD, they are not in one group. So you can see that there is a formation, a sort of coalition building formation at the European level from all these right-wing groups, but you can also see that there's division, and the division gets manifest when it comes to the group building at the level of the European Parliament, and it's not yet decided. It's not yet decided on the right, and it's not yet decided on the left, as you say, for instance, BSW, the new left coalition, Sarah Wagenknecht, Bündnis Sarah Wagenknecht, also there, all bets are off to know where she will land in the spectrum of the right, of the left-wing parties, yeah, because we have the left, the Social Democrats, the left, and because for a European group, you need 25 deputies who come from 8 different countries. And so it's a very tricky mathematics to get a group status on the European Parliament. And only if you have a group status, you have all the parliamentarian sort of rights, which is posing questions and all of this in the parliamentarian process. Yeah, we will be seeing this. It's not yet decided. It remains open for now, and it's very, very interesting to see the composition. Yeah. Now, if you say that, for instance, being against war is not right, I would agree. I mean, what is right about not about pacifism or about being against the war? It needs to be said that classically, these were left-wing parties who were against the war, for instance, yeah. Or it would also need to be said that, for instance, the Pledge for Freedom, I mean, freedom, all the liberation movements throughout the world that we saw in the 20th century are most of the time left-wing movements, yeah. So today it's very interesting, just in analytical terms, to see that most of the so-called right-wing popular parties have the name freedom in their name, yeah. Die Freiheitlichen in Austria, FPÖ. So the freedom is now tagged to be a populist right-wing thing, whereas freedom, say in the 20th century, were more left-wing movements. And the same is now for peace. Peace was classically, if you remember, Olaf Palme, Kreisky, Brandt, was peace a classical left-wing social democratic claim. And now the peace claim is more with the so-called populist party, say Orban. Orban is the only one who at the December Council, at the EU meeting, basically, you remember, needed to go out of the door so that the association agreements or the assistance packages for the Ukraine could be signed. Yeah, it's just because Orban had to leave the room. Now, there's a very interesting detail here, because as you know, the European Union is run by presidencies, and the presidencies are in a turnus. And the next turnus presidency after the Belgian one is on 1st of July, the Hungarian presidency. And there is some talk in Brussels, because Hungary, Orban is the one who is one of these populist parties, very strong voice against weapons for Ukraine and for peace. there is some, say, juridical talk in Brussels that the Hungary could not get the presidency of the European Union because Hungary itself is under surveillance mechanism after Article 7, because Hungary is infringing justice of law and all of these things. And so there is now a juridical talk whether Hungary, being itself infringed of breaking Article 7, can run the presidency. I think, I mean, we will need to wait for this. It would be a very sort of political novelty if Hungary would be prevented from running the EU presidency. But having said that, that was just a footnote. You ask about the sort of populist wave. I told you that first we need to wait where they unfold, in which party coalition and in which group, because they're not united. But second, also in terms of policy and programming, they are not the same. If you look, for instance, Orban and Meloni, you will notice that Meloni, being populist or whatever right-wing she is, we may discuss, but Meloni is in favor of Ukraine assistance. She is not anti-war. Right. She is not anti-war coalition, and she is in favor of the assistance. For the FPÖ in Austria, it looks pretty similar. It's a bit less outspoken, but Austria has a strong discussion, for instance, on giving up neutrality. That has been discussed because there are many, military convoys already transpassing Austria. And we have been seeing discussions recently in Austria whether or not Austria should join NATO. And actually the FPÖ, so the Austrian populists, were not strongly against. You can see in the AfD, in the German party, that if you look, for instance, at the Commission of Defense in the German Bundestag, you would basically see the AfD, I wouldn't say half-half, but say a third against two-thirds, but you have AfD people who are in favor of the alliance, who are in favor of weapons delivery, and you have two-thirds of the AfD who are not. Yeah, so you would not be able to say that the German AfD is as strong on peace or as unconditionally on peace like Orban. For instance, the party seems more a little bit split or diverse, if you want. Yeah, and also the AfD has some Anträge, some papers in the German parliament in which actually they do support the Rheinmetall. I mean the
weapons making.
How do you call it? That the government gives Rheinmetall money basically to have weapons for Ukraine now, and obviously
it's a defense company.
It depends. Yeah. So what I'm saying is the AfD is not as clear or as sort of unique on this question as Orban may be seen, and Meloni is not, and Marine Le Pen is not. Marine Le Pen has a very interesting development behind her. You may argue that until the time of her father, Jean-Marie Le Pen, say 2011, the party was, say, if you want, so pro-Russian, whatever, but the party changed. They were also anti-EU and anti-Euro. But in these days, in the last two elections, so 2017 and 2022, and now, Marine Le Pen is basically outspoken in favor of the European Union, does not go against the Euro. Obviously, they have a strong stance on migration policy. I would say migration policy is the topic that unites the right across all EU countries. But on other policies, as is defense, Ukraine, Gaza, and so on and so forth, the so-called populist parties are more divided. Also, you would need to notice that in terms of economic policy, you would probably argue that, for instance, Poland, the Polish PIS, or the Hungarian Fidesz party, that they have a strong, say, social policy impetus. Yeah, for instance, if you look at granting women, yeah, for children, for giving birth, it's basically very good social policy. I mean, for instance, the Polish government under the Peace Party pays 4 times what we call children allowances than the German children allowances. So it's a very strong social policy, whereas say the AfD And even Marine Le Pen a little less, but the AfD is more neoliberal. So if we want to say that there's a whole spectrum on policies, you would probably say that on social and economic policies, there are differences, that on Ukraine and peace, there are some differences, that on the EU and what do you do with the EU, yeah, there are also differences. So yes, I would agree, migration is probably what unites them, but even, say, being anti-establishment or anti-Atlanticist, you would not be able to say this across the EU countries with respect to the populist parties. It's a little bit more tricky, and that is why the coalition building now is really, really interesting to see where they will basically unite on.
Well, thank you. But you know, all in all, one would. Could we not say that things are not going to be the same, as you actually pointed out at the beginning of the interview, or at the beginning of the talk, within the European Union? There may have certain differences over the way the European Union should basically take shape, and over various policies the European Union should follow or should not follow. But overall, these parties are not EU enthusiasts, are they? You know, no. They are not necessarily, and they want certain and strong reforms within the EU, even if they change their tact a bit, you know, at the strategic level and at the level of decision making, they seem to be quite, if not anti, but they are looking at the relations with the United States from a critical point of view, aren't they?
Yes, I mean, thank you for the question. I would perfectly agree. There is strong, I mean, a strong anti-EU resentment, and the anti-EU resentment and basically legitimate critique. You know, I mean, I'm a political scientist. Yeah, most of social scientists in the European Union, I mean, those people who are in political science like I, or sociology, or even economists, having fundamental critique points towards what is called the European governance system. I mean, if you look at the Euro crisis that we have 15 years ago, 2012-11, yeah, where we had this problem with the so-called lazy Greeks, yeah, because we tagged the Greeks, we blamed the Greeks, although we had a banking crisis, yeah. So there were in-depth problems with the governance structures of the Euro. Just to recall this, but in 2012, the European Council had a proposal which was called GEUM, Genuine Economic and Monetary Union, GEMU. And we wanted to have a fiscal unity, we wanted to have political unity, we wanted to have budgetary unity and all of this, and we couldn't make it, yeah? And there is, I think, fundamental and, oh, by the way, legitimate critique in the structures of the European Union, and most of the European scientists say that we do have a democratic deficit. There are many points to make why the European Union in itself has a democratic deficit, because there is in a way no real opposition, you know, there is always a grand coalition. You have a double legislative, there's a double executive, because the council and the parliament decide together, all of this, yeah? So now come the populist party, and what they say is, look, we do have a democratic deficit, we need to tackle it. The citizens are unhappy, the citizens cannot express what they want. The EU has become a technocratic structure. The EU does stuff like climate Green Deal, or it does like next generation EU programming. It does like European Digital Service Act. I mean, there are a lot of technical, highly technical problems. These packages all basically fund lots of projects which triple into the nation states, yeah? And all this is of no accountability, yeah? So there is a democratic deficit in the European Union, and most scientists say this. The problem is that when the populists say this in the political sphere, then it becomes a problematic argument, yeah, because we had all these claims about Dexit and Frexit and Uxit, the Italexit, you know, I mean, continuing Brexit, everybody wants to leave. And the tricky thing is that even Orban does not really want to leave the European Union because there's a lot of money engaged. Yeah. So the tricky thing is how you are making an opposition within a system that actually you don't like, that actually you criticize, and you criticize it for reason, but you do not want to leave it or you cannot leave it. Yeah, because what most people oversee, I mean, to make that point very precisely, if the German AfD says Dexit, yeah, we are not the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom could leave the European Union. They were only in the single market. It was hard enough for the UK to leave the European Union. But Germany has the euro. So if you say Dexit and you leave the European Union, you also leave European Central Bank, the money system, and so on and so forth. So you leave the euro. So it's not such an easy thing to say Dexit, Frexit, Öxit, because then the question arises, do we stay in the euro or do we, you know, let the euro crash? And I think that wouldn't be a good idea. So there's a very tricky sort of balance here to say, look, we deeply need to reform the system. It needs to become more democratic. But this exit strategy is perhaps not the good idea. And I think the populist parties, to their credit in a way, they bring up this problem. But at a certain level, this problem is in a way unsolvable. Yeah, unless, and perhaps I can make another very precise point, unless the European Union would decide to go for a new convention and to ultimately go for a new discussion about the European Constitution. And if I may, because that is what is at stake at large. I mean, we are now talking about Ukraine accession. We are still having Turkey in line for accession. We can talk about it later. We have the Balkan countries. So the EU easily could have 35 members. And nobody knows how you want to manage the European Union with 35 member states. Because it's already in an institutional deadlock. Yeah, we are already in an institutional deadlock with 26 member states. So the question is, could we solve this through a new approach for a European constitution? Let's remind everybody that the European Union tried to have a European constitution in 2003. It failed, then came the French no, the Dutch no, and so on and so forth. So 20 years ago, we wanted to do a constitution, and now things are getting interesting. If I may say, in October last year, October 23, precisely on the 25th of October, there was an Antrag, there was a paper in the Institutional Committee of the European Parliament, AFCO, and this paper actually called for what I was suggesting, a European convention. And the paper asked for that convention that would be launched after the new commission now is in place. It will be in place in November 24. The idea was that this convention would go for 3 or 4 years of reflection until 29. And then in 29, there would be a draft for a new European constitution. And that constitution would be basically do a big bang sort of new thing to tackle the problem of enlargement and institutional reform. I mean, deepening and widening. And it was even suggested by some, say, federalist deputies in the European Parliament that this constitution should then not be voted or ratified by each and every EU member state, but instead it should be voted directly by the European people. So 460 million European people across the continent would have a one-day single vote. Do we want that constitution? Yes or no? So now, this paper was obviously rejected in the AFCO committee, and the idea of a convention was then wiped away from the table by the European Council, because this is the game since long in the European Union that the European Council normally is not so interested in hearing the citizens and what they want. Yeah, so I must say that I have been very sorry that this endeavor failed. By the time I wrote a manifesto with 120 other European political scientists, and we all voted for this convention, because for me it would have been an ideal opportunity, basically to democratize the European system. So now we will need to wait what is happening after the new commission is set up.
Well, to democratize the European Union institutional basis, I think let's continue with our discussion on one of the core problems which unites all these right-wing parties, if you like. That is the migration. Now, so I think, as you said, this is the single issue, probably the only issue on which they all agree, including Meloni's party, to Orban's and AfD and the Austrian Freedom Party and all the others, including Wilders' party in Netherlands and what have you. Now, on this question, they are all against migration for quite understandable reasons, on which, if you would like to, please do comment. But there is also this thing. Now, I tried to follow a news, basically, that was about the European Union court in Luxembourg finding Hungary for not allowing migration and for not bringing its policies in parallel with those of the European Union on that particular issue, up to multiple $100 million. So it wasn't just a small fine. Now, how would these parties, if they were to come to power in their individual countries, how would they basically implement or how would they translate their ideas into practical policies? Could they do that?
Thank you for the question. I guess it's a Nobel Prize winning question. I mean, to pretend that there is some sort of single quick answer to the problem of migration, I think that would be wrong. Yeah. Let's just, before answering in detail your question, let's just say that we have been seeing for 10, 15 years, the Middle East more or less exploding, starting with the war in Iraq and then, going from there, Gaddafi, Libya, Syria. So basically, whole North Africa is destabilized, and it has been destabilized by the so-called democracy promotion policies of the United States. And we have been seeing Saddam Hussein, Gaddafi, everything, Syria, huge and large conflicts. And what we have not seen, unfortunately, is democracy promotion. What we have been seeing is devastation, destruction, war, and civil war. And the poor area, whole North Africa, seems not to go out of this in any time soon. Yeah, so it's an explosive situation, and it's very risky for Europe, and it's deployable. It's a very bad development. Because this is so, basically, Sub-Saharan Africa has a way to Europe, because formerly the region was more or less a buffer zone, if you want so, and since 10, 8 years, whatever, there is this Sub-Saharan Africa sort of possibility. So now, I think we have several problems. The one we never or not so much talk about is this whole, in German, you would call it Fluchtursachenbekämpfung, which is fighting the reasons for refugees. That would mean, for instance, changing the agricultural policy of the European Union, all the exceeds of corn or whatever we push to Africa, we destroy local markets. The EU does certain nasty things to basically erode market structures and labor structures in Africa, fishing the areas, the base of the Horn of Africa, and so on and so forth. So, if we are really reasoning about why do these people come, there would be some reflection to do over not destroying their markets, not destroying their agriculture, not exploiting them, not do land grabbing and all these things. Yeah. So this is sort of,
sorry, just in terms of exploiting their resources, I think, for instance, I heard Meloni saying several times, giving examples of French exploitation of the African countries' resources in particular, you know, you put in a puppet government there, and then you exploit their resources, and there is very little going out to the people, and in the end, this is what you get.
Yeah.
Remember, yeah.
So yes, and you know, Meloni is in a way very smart about it, yeah, because she has several times pointed to the Front CFA, so which is this African front, which is in Western Africa, still very solid, and where you have where the La Caisse des Dépôts Français, so the French Treasury, has a hold on the currency that is created, yeah. So basically,
exactly.
The French are participating up to 50% from each franc CFA, which is spent in Africa. Yeah, so this is obviously an indirect exploitation, and we should talk about changing it. Yeah, what I wanted to make the point is, I know that Germany, I know in France, I know in Italy, and you know, my sons are living in Paris. I'm many times in France. I've been in Italy, many Italian friends, but the refugee question really became the topic that brought the populist parties up. Yeah, there is this sentiment of overload, too many, and so on and so forth, especially since the 2016 pictures when we had the Balkan route, and Germany is in a way still suffering from it, because the consequences are all the things we have now in the television news, which is perhaps you have heard in Turkey about Mannheim. There was a policeman who was basically killed by an Afghan who was, you know, there was a conflict and a policeman was killed. And obviously then you have all these, you know, popular outrage. Yeah, how can it be that somebody who should have been sent back to Afghanistan, who was still the country, killed a German policeman, and then the press goes 3 weeks about too many foreigners who are, you know, breaking the German laws. And we can see very heated discussions about this, not only obviously in Germany, but also in France. If you remember, it started already with the terror attacks, yeah, Bataclan, Islamist terror. Then we had, if you remember, the school teacher in France, Paty, who was basically decapitated in Plain Street, and so on and so forth. Yeah, so just to say that there is incident and there is popular sort of talk about this migration, too much sort of argument, which is overwhelming in whole Europe since years, and the populist parties are sort of sitting on the wave. Yeah, I was just saying, or trying to say, that obviously the heated discussion in the newspapers and the problems, which nobody is denying. For instance, this morning I heard in Germany, Deutschlandfunk is the national radio, a very serious radio, and they had a reportage about migrants in German schools. And they were basically saying that you now have schools in which you have no German-speaking child. Ukrainian, you know, or other countries. But in the end, no German-speaking child. And then the question is, what does the teacher do? And so there are serious questions and they need to be tackled. Yeah. Still, we need to manage this refugee problem. I am not in favor of walls. You know, there is always this sort of Mexican Trump, we build a wall, blah, blah, blah. I personally, I think that walls does not help. I would like to see a very honest discussion in Germany about the distinguishment between asylum and economic refugees, as you say. So those who come for economic reasons or only economic reasons. I personally think that economic reasons are also a reason to leave a country. If you don't have a living, you leave. Yeah, so it's a very tricky distinction, but still there are political refugees who, you know, and there are other refugees, yeah. And there is German legislation who could put this in place. The same for Denmark, the same for Sweden, the same for Dutch, who basically have better managements. I mean, the Danish or the Swedes or the Dutch are tackling these problems. They have smarter routines to scrutinize the people. So just one concrete proposal, yeah, what you could do in Europe, for instance, would be that you have a European green card like the US, and you gather the, say, qualified refugees through a green card proposal, and everybody can apply, and you say, look, 50,000 or whoever figure of people can come to Europe, you know, through a green card visa, and then you take the asylum sort of legislation at the European level for political refugees only. Yeah, so I think we should be very creative about the solutions. But first, let me say, Turkey has done a lot of burden. I mean, everybody knows that there was this EU-Turkish deal that was negotiated by the European Stability Initiative. I know Gerald Knaus, by the way, in person, who was the guy who suggested this to Angela Merkel. So I know that Turkey must feel, I don't know, you need to tell me how Turkey feels, yeah? But I was in Istanbul, I saw Istanbul growing. I heard a lot about Syrians in Turkey, so I can understand that Turkey also has a very sort of, whatever, difficult discussion about refugees. What I would like to say is that the other difficult discussion is obviously what are the answers, because all these pushback operations, Frontex, all this, yeah, is obviously sort of a gray zone of legality. Yeah, I mean, if the European Union always claims to be, you know, in itself understanding a liberal, open, tolerant, rule of law sort of political body, then anything that comes close to pushback operations, that anything that comes close to not caring for refugees, which could sink in the middle sea, in the Mediterranean Sea, then this is tricky. So again, I would love to see a better distinction between political asylum seekers and refugees which leave their countries for economic reasons. I think a European green card could actually be a good idea to also make the effort to what is said to get the sort of the qualified refugees who, because there is always a labor demand. I mean, we do not need to deny that Germany, with its demography, especially if you look at aged care and all these things, that there is a certain level of working migrants that you will need to have, yeah, because German demography looks like we are shrinking from 80 million to 64 million in 10 years. We have a clear overage society. So again, all these are facets of a very, very multiple complex. And I think it would already help much if we could claim that those who come respect the country's legislation, those who come respect the country's language, dress codes, whatever, you know, that you have an integration that is happening. And perhaps to end on this, what is especially problematic for Germany is that we have so many Turks since the first wave in the 60s, you know, this Facharbeiter, you know, in the 60s, which we badly needed, who were the ones who promoted the German Wirtschaftswunder, and they are all perfectly integrated. I personally know a lot of these Turks. Yeah, some of them don't speak even Turkish. They live here, they were born here, they live here. The father has worked for Daimler Chrysler, and they are now engineers at Daimler. So there is a professional scale up, and so on and so forth. And these first generation Turks, there were no problem of integration, and there were no problems of scarf or no scarf, you know, all these discussions. The problem now is that you have second, third, fourth generation of Arab, Islam sort of refugees. And the problem is that it's barely distinguished in the discussions. And so I can understand that there are some Turks of the first generation who feel very uneasy with the populist wave now, because in the street, people don't distinguish whether you are, you know, Turkish family since 1960 or Turkish family since 2000 or Syrian family since 2016. You understand what I mean, yeah? Yep. So again, I think this is one of the trickiest discussions we can have in Europe, and it has the potential to politically blow up a lot.
Well, yes, thank you very much. I'm not so much familiar with the German situation and the Turks, although I follow it a bit. But in my years in Britain, I used to see it, you know, with my own eyes. The first generation of the Pakistanis and the Indian Muslims and others, including other Muslims, Bangladesh and blah, blah, they used to be quite willing to integrate into the British society. They got integrated, the first generation, they say. But the second generation, again, roughly got integrated, but from the third generation onwards, problems rose up, and then they were complaining about that, although their way of integration and what the British were expecting of them in terms of integration was perhaps even less than what some of the continental European countries would expect the prospective migrants in terms of integration. But again, they seem to have lots of problems. It is perhaps because of it is certainly to do with the rise of Islam in political sense across the Muslim world. My guess is that, it's a long subject, but my guess is, I may be mistaken, but the political Islam has collapsed. It has collapsed politically, but the implications, we don't know what the implications will be for all the Muslim countries. In Turkey too, it was thought at some 20 plus years ago, something of a very important thing, into the political system. But now people sort of shy away from political Islam, which may be good, for the whole of the Muslim world, because we seem to need a reform in our interpretation of the religion in terms of daily life and what have you.
Let me.
Well, if you want to say something on that, yeah, please go ahead.
I totally agree. I mean, everything we developed in the last 5 minutes of our talk to say that this is really has a potential to blow up the political spectrum in Europe, because that's the issue that is ardent in all countries. But especially it is ardent because Franco-German is the tandem of the European mechanism. Yeah,
exactly.
Now we see that there is this Syrian sort of integration to Germany of the last years, which tops on the Turkish migration to Germany of 30 years ago. Yeah. But that is Syria and Germany and Turkey in first, and then sub-Saharan Africa. In France, you have Maghreb migration. So you have Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco, which is still a different sort of migration. And you have huge historical discussions, La France, Algerie, I mean, just to remind what in the past were the Franco-Algerian relations and the Maghrebian. So now we know that Turkey is not the Arab world. So we have a clear also distinction between the French interest in the Maghrebian area and the German political interest in the, say, Syria, Turkish area. And it's not the same. And if we reason in foreign policy, because we are talking geostrategic compass here, we need to understand that the Franco-German tandem always is key in the European policy making. I think personally we can talk about it. It's broken since long. But one aspect why it's broken is this sort of different geostrategic outreach to the communities, France, Arabic, and then Mali, what the French are doing in Bamako, and then the Maghrebian area, and then Germany looking more Turkey, Syria. And then this is strategically already very complicated. On top of it, you obviously have, say, religious conflict, because in Germany, obviously, there is an anti-Semitic sort of twist in the Arab community. And because Germany and its special, say, history, Holocaust and all of this, we now have state reason that basically, for instance, in the Gaza, in the current Gaza conflict, there is a necessity to be loyal with Israel. And so, as we have been seeing in Germany now, like throughout the world, look at the United States and other places in the world, we have been seeing student protests against genocide in Gaza. We have been seeing student protest in terms of, for ceasefire and all of these things. And we have huge policy discussion whether that protest is allowed. what is since 3 weeks, basically the top news in German news now is that our Minister for Science and the Universities, Stark-Watzinger, she has been issued in an interview that because there was this protest, Gaza protest in German universities, and it was supported by some of university professors and teachers. And Stark-Watzinger has basically issued that she wants to cut the professors who supported the Gaza protest from financial means in the university. So she wants basically she wants to sanction political positions by the money flows at universities. This, as we speak, is a rather big scandal, and obviously she is called to retire and to withdraw. Actually, she is not yet, but I just want to say that the migration policy is not only migration policy. It's not only the problem that these migrants normally are living, they are on job competition and on labor competition with the lower classes of German society. That is one problem. They are on they have
their own political agenda now.
I just wanted to say there is the problem of job competition and of home competition, you know, where do they live with the underprivileged class of German. That's one thing. But there is the political umbrella, and the political umbrella is this sort of Judaism versus Islamism sort of thing. And the moment you have sort of migrants, Muslim migrants, who then they are all statistics in terms of criminalization, you know, who is criminal and who not. But if in addition you have an anti-Semitic argument that is made in Germany, then basically it's like you're putting, you know, fire into a box of oil, yeah? And that is happening in Germany, and it is also happening in France. If you look at the recent days in France after Macron dissolved the parliament, we have been, you know, the problem, who is defending, I mean, who is basically protecting the Jews. And interestingly enough, André Glucksmann twittered a couple of days ago something like, I'm quoting by heart, yeah, I need to, not that I need to vote for Marine Le Pen to get the Jews protected in France. Yeah, so we are in a completely inverse spectrum where, where Marine Le Pen is actually trying to
protect the Jews,
pro-Israel arguments, yeah, as anti-Islamist sort of populist movement in France. And so just saying that the two things which are difficult in this discussion is the social integration, yeah, on housing, on schools, on labor. But the other argument is the overwhelming religious sort of thing which is there. And this is a stress factor for modern European societies. And I guess it has a lot to do with, you know, religious orthodoxism in one way or the other.
Just perhaps a few words, if you would like to say about, I mean, I know it's too early, but with the advent of Trump to power in the United States, and if these populist parties, as you style them, were to come to power in European countries, would we be talking about a different transatlantic system and different Euro-Atlantic system and a completely different NATO and what have you? You know, would you like to speculate?
Look, I mean, first, I would like to say that what we are observing is in a way the opposite, which is that most of the party systems of EU countries are going Americanizing, yeah, because the Americas has a system of a polarization, two parties, Democrats and Republicans, and the Republicans are the populists, so there is good and evil, you know, so basically that's the American system today. But if you look at France, for instance, it's a totally, I mean, the former left-right spectrum in France is, you know, blown up. And what you see is two blocks now. Yeah, you have Rassemblement Populaire with the conservatives. You have been seeing that Le Parti Républicain, so the conservatives, Ciotti, wanted to have an alliance with Front National, and there was huge tumultus in France about this. And then Front Populaire, which resonates the 36th Front Populaire. Yeah, so there are two blocks. It's a little bit like, in a way, the American system, Democrats against the populists, is now Front Populaire against Rassemblement and the conservatives. Yeah. So in Germany, you have the Ampel, which is liberal, green, and the Social Democrats, who are basically sort of the good classical parties, now challenged by a blue wave, and we will need to see what comes up in the regional elections in Germany soon. So first, before answering to Trump, I think it's very important to notify that we are seeing the Americanization of party systems throughout the European Union in a truly polarized way, which is the Democrats against the populist. Yeah, and it's a very, very sad polarization, because European party systems are built in a very different tradition than the United States, and it's unfortunate that the polarization could succeed that much in most or in some EU countries. So now on the geostrategic point, and now you are questioning me on foreign policy, what do I am expecting when Trump should be elected in November? Well, I mean, first, just as a disclaimer, in a personal capacity, I do not like Mr. Trump, you know, like women grab her by the pussy. I mean, it's just like insane. And there are, you know, some of these arguments as a temper argument, you would say, oh my God, yeah. But as you say, on a more analytical argument, if Mr. Trump, we don't know, because the real question is what will he do on NATO, and also Mr. Trump is claiming for the 2% goal on NATO, you know, so he has a strong argument in saying Europe should be on its own. He has a strong argument still that all the EU countries should comply with their 2% goal for NATO. So Trump is not sort of an anti-NATO, anti-militarized, pacified guy. That he is not. And probably there's some, we call it in these days, deep state behind. So, you know, Trump also will need to do probably some things that he perhaps does not want to do. Yeah. So I would still argue that there might be more chance for peace for Europe with Russia. And that what some intellectuals in Germany, but not only in Germany, also French, also Americans, who are basically arguing, you know, like Mersheimer or McGregor or Jacques Boot from Switzerland or Kroneschmalz in Germany. I mean, there are some very outspoken voices, Jeffrey Sachs, for instance, Emmanuel Todd, just to name a few. But all these people are first retracing the conflict Russia-Ukraine since 15 years. And now it's pretty clear that expansion of the Russian Federation or imperialism is not the thing or the issue, but the real thing is neutrality of Ukraine. And we knew it. It has been in most of the papers since 15 years. It was in the Minsk agreements, and it was even in the draft for peace agreement of April 2022 that the Turks kindly negotiated or tried to moderate. Yeah. So having said that, if the Americans are withdrawing, and it seems as if they do, I mean, even the Americans with Biden and the in-place government seems to give signals that they want to withdraw, and that they say that's a European war now, and that Europe should do this and that, and Europe should fund this and that. We could expect that if Trump gets elected, that this momentum is growing, and that Trump even more wants to sort of withdraw from that conflict, leaving Europe a chance. But when I say Europe, I mean also the Turks and perhaps other countries stepping in. I mean, those countries who have been at the Lucerne Peace Conference just a couple of days ago, so that we can have what basically we wanted in the 90s, a European security architecture with and not against Russia. That was the goal in the Charta de Paris of 91. This was the reason to build the OECD. This was the reason because in the 80s we have understood we cannot have peace against each other, but peace with each other. And I could imagine that if Trump is elected, leaving the space to the Europeans, that we could build up a peace coalition and in different circumstances, I mean, I would say hopefully negotiate with Russia and go for a peace agreement, or even if it's not straight a peace agreement, that we could go for some freezing of the conflict and, you know, freeze it and tackle it in 5 or 10 years again. Personally, that would be my hope. That's just last sentence, but what I call the emancipation of Europe, emancipation in the sense of having a clear, distinct European foreign policy in which Europe stands on its own and in which Europe can actually openly address that our security interests, especially with respect to Russia, are not congruent with the security interests of the United States of America. A Europe that could say this and could materialize this in its own policy, that's basically the Europe I'm working for, yeah, emancipatory Europe. And I hope with the Trump election, we can gain momentum for this.
Well, thank you very much. With such a Europe, perhaps Turkey could also stabilize its relations. You know, if there is the Russia dimension, why not Turkish dimension in the European Union, not only in the security field, but also in terms of industrial production and what have you, joint ventures between German companies, French companies, Italian companies, and Turkish companies inside Turkey, because Turkey would then be able to offer quite a bit to such a European Union, not this sort of European Union. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. Go ahead. You want to say something? Yeah.
That Europe I call, you know, European Republic. I wrote a book about this quite successfully years ago. Yeah, why Europe should become a republic, a completely democratized but also decentralized sort of political body. And personally, I would love to welcome Turkey, who is waiting since so long, since '64, get God's promises, and now accession since 2004. And I think, you know, with the pressure actually that is put on Ukraine membership of the European Union, it would be non-explicable if Ukraine joins the EU earlier than Turkey. So I think the Turkish accession, which is now freezed, and you know, I was in Istanbul, and I think the Turks are no longer complaining. For them, the EU, this is sort of tempi passati, it's over. But I think the moment that the Ukrainian accession talks should gain momentum, I think the Ukraine cannot join the EU for many reasons. It's not complying with the criteria, it's not democratic, it's not this, it's not that. But still the discourse in Brussels is pretty much putting emphasis on EU accession with Ukraine. And I think that would be and should be a good moment to reconsider the Turkey-EU relation or the Turkish-European relation in a totally new setting, because what we also need to achieve is a Europe that gets itself ready for a multipolar world. And in that perspective, we need to do the reform stuff, we need to emancipate Europe, and we need to basically talk about enlargement in a quite different sort of sense. And in that respect, let me welcome Turkey and the new Turkish-European relationship.
Thank you very much. In a completely new setting, as you said, hopefully, and as we say in Turkey, inshallah. Yeah, thank you very much, Ulrike, and hope to see you soon again, somewhere either or in Turkey or somewhere else in Europe. And thank you very much for taking your time out to be with us. And this is the end of our strategic talk for today. We have hosted Professor Ulrike Guérot, a professor of political science and international relations, the founder of the European Democracy Lab, and the co-director of that. This is our interview for today, for this week, and see you in our next interview. Bye-bye for now.